All right, so a little while on Twitter, I asked what minimum frame rate you'd be happy with in ray-traced single-player games, and the majority of people selected 60 frames per second. So today we're going to have a look and see whether the RTX 4080 Super is actually enough to not run just normal ray-traced games, but actually path-tracing games. All right, so here we are at 4K native resolution, so DLAA with full path tracing enabled, no frame generation, and it's a horrible experience. It's not even a cinematic experience. It's 16 to 18 frames per second, and it's kind of rough. I don't think anybody would play like this if I had an 18 frames per second option on my Twitter poll. It would have been laughed at, obviously. All right, so 18 frames per second, it's not going to happen, right? But let's see what DLSS quality can do for us. But now that we have a 4K output resolution, we might be able to be more aggressive with our DLSS, right? So we can go to DLSS balanced / performance. I think DLSS performance still looks okay at 4K. I personally wouldn't go much below, or wouldn't go below DLSS balanced, but that's just a personal preference. I do play some games DLSS balanced at 1440p even, and it does become slightly noticeable depending on the DLSS implementation. But DLSS performance at 4K, I do notice the DLSS implementation a little bit more, if I can put it like that. All right, so 30-ish frames per second here, which some people would still be fine with. All right, no shame in playing at 30 frames per second. Now, if we go, so that was a 66 render resolution. So DLSS balanced is 58% render resolution. Right, so let's see if we get to 60. We're not getting to 60 frames per second here at all. And I don't think DLSS performance is going to get us to 60 frames per second either. So at 1440p, yes, you can play with full path tracing enabled, even native resolution, but at 4K, that's just a little bit too rough. Now, sure, DLSS does decrease the internal render resolution, but there's still overhead. So let's see DLSS performance. So this would be 1080p native resolution. Let's 1080p internal resolution upscale to 4K. All right, and we are almost there. We are sitting at 55-ish frames per second. The game still looks good. I mean, you might just notice a little bit more flickering in heavy foliage areas. The shadows might flicker a bit more, but we are not getting 60 frames per second here. And if we do enable frame generation here, I think it's borderline. For me personally, I'd aim for 60 frames per second plus before enabling frame generation. But I mean, it's up to each and everyone's tastes. I do just prefer the slightly less input latency with starting off at a higher base frame rate. So I'm going to test ultra performance here, which is 33%. Okay, so 33% would be 720p. 720p upscale to 4K. Let's see if we get 60 frames per second, and that's actually a pretty a pretty big bump. It's actually the biggest bump we've seen so far from any of the DLSS presets. Now, DLSS ultra performance, you can, I don't know, it's really, it's your choice. I'm not going to tell you what to do, and it can still look good, but I do think that you will start to notice a lot of artifacting, especially in finer detail like hair. I'm not sure if this would come across in the YouTube video well. It's actually not terrible. I'm not going to lie. It's really, this game's DLSS implementation is actually not terrible in that specific aspect of it, but there are some other issues I do have with this DLSS implementation. It does over sharpen the image quite a bit. All right, so 80-ish frames per second here with DLSS ultra performance. So let's go ahead. I do think it's a little bit too aggressive for most people. So let's go ahead and do DLSS performance. We were getting around 50-ish frames per second there. And let's see what frame generation can do for us. Let's just keep an eye on the average input latency there, average PC latency. It's actually pretty good. It's lower than what we had at DLSS ultra performance, I believe we were seeing around 60 milliseconds. But remember, that was without any Nvidia reflex. Now we've got Nvidia reflex enabled, so the average PC latency would be lower than previously, even with frame generation enabled. So here we are, 80-ish frames per second. Personally, the final frame rate output of 80 with frame generation is just not, it's not an ideal experience, although I think in a game like this it is playable, though I'd personally not recommend that. So for Black Myth Wukong, 1440p seems to be the sweet spot with an RTX 4080 Super if you want to use full path tracing. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Alright, so here we are with Cyberpunk 2077, and currently I'm just at 1440p on the high preset with DLAA, no upscaling and also no frame generation, and we can see we are getting a very decent average PC latency there because we do have Nvidia Reflex enabled. It's a toggle that you can enable separately in this game. Most games actually allow you to do that. I'm not sure what the issue is with the Black Myth Wukong. 120-ish frames per second here at native on the high preset. So I'm going to just show you quickly, if we go ahead and look at the settings. I know it says custom, but it's because I changed quite a few settings here. I'm going to leave the exact same settings, right? It's just a high preset, and I'm going to enable ray tracing. So luckily for this game, we don't have to restart the game for any of the path tracing effects to apply. It does say you have to restart the game for frame generation, but that's also not true. All right, so with full, this is not full ray tracing, this is ray tracing on ultra, I'd say, because we are using the ultra global illumination setting or ray traced lighting, and we are getting around 60 frames per second at 1440p native on the high preset. Now the high preset and the ultra preset don't make that big a difference when you are using ray tracing, because it mostly affects screen space reflections and that kind of stuff, which is quite a little bit more heavy on the ultra preset. But when you enable ray tracing, those settings get overwritten or overridden. All right, so we're not able to hit 60 frames per second here continuously, and for a first-person shooter, I'd say it is kind of necessary to hit 60 frames per second. Right, let's see. I'm just going to enable DLSS quality quickly. So we'll just DLSS quality and still the exact same settings, and we should see a pretty decent boost to our frame rate here, so 100 frames per second. Game's perfectly fine, and we are seeing average PC latency of 28-ish milliseconds. 100% perfect for a first-person shooter. I know it's like a hybrid first-person shooter slash RPG slash whatever, but I'm just talking about the shooting view aspect of it. It's first person, so 100 frames per second. Yeah, pretty decent experience. 26-27 milliseconds for our average PC latency there. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation. We don't have DLSS ray reconstruction enabled. That actually improves the frame rate quite a bit as well. So let's go ahead with DLSS frame generation. There it says you have to restart the game, but you can see DLSS frame generation does take effect, and we are getting 150-ish frames per second here. And PC latency went up by around 10 to 12 milliseconds. Game feels perfectly fine at these higher frame rates, 150, 160 frames per second. Now this is basically where I play the game currently, and I just cap it to 158 because my monitor's refresh rate is 165 Hertz, and with the Nvidia Reflex and G-Sync and V-Sync enabled, it caps it to 158 frames per second. Anyway, so I'm almost able to max out my monitor using these settings. Alright, so pretty decent experience here, 158 frames per second. So let's go ahead and enable path tracing. This is one of the heaviest games when it comes. This is actually the heaviest game when it comes to path tracing. So let's go ahead and enable path tracing. I am going to use DLAA and no frame generation. Now remember, we had let's just see if frame generation did disable. It did. It did. Okay, so remember with Black Myth Wukong, we were able to hit 60 frames per second with full path tracing enabled at native resolution on the high preset. Now we are down to 30 frames per second. And it's pretty bad, and the motion fluidity is quite bad, but there is motion blur as well due to the preset. It can be disabled, obviously, and it does hide a little bit of the I'd say, unpleasantness of playing at this lower frame rate. Once again, there are people that are perfectly fine playing at 30 frames per second. I'm just not one of those people. So 34-ish frames per second. So let's see what we actually need to do to get 60 frames per second here. I don't think it's going to go well at all at 4K, but we'll get there. So DLSS quality without any frame generation. Let's just see. Now we are getting 60-ish frames per second. PC latency is around 36 milliseconds. No, I don't think it'll maintain 60 frames per second at all times here, but it's a pretty acceptable, decent experience here. DLSS does look good in this game, and it does look especially good if you change the preset to E. You can do that with the DLSS tweaks. You can just change the DLSS preset to preset E, and it does look a little bit better in motion as well. Alright, so 60 frames per second, perfectly fine with DLSS quality. Unfortunately, path tracing native resolution is not possible in this game. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation here quickly. Just have a look at our PC latency. It's sitting at 33 milliseconds. So we'll just enable DLSS frame generation. Once again, it does say you need to restart the game, but it's not true. If you enable FSR frame generation, or if you switch between the two, you need to restart the game. Alright, so let me just reset our numbers. PC latency is kind of on the high side now with 47-ish milliseconds, and the game is still perfectly playable. I think it's just maybe, I'm not sure if the upgrade from ray tracing ultra to path tracing is really worth the performance hit. We lost about 50% of our, not 50%, around 40 frames per second. So it is kind of rough. We were getting around 150, 160 frames per second with these exact same settings, just with RT Ultra. I know it's boring. I'm just running around. Sorry. I just wanted to test the frame rate here. So 110-ish frames per second. So let's see if we can get a better frame rate here just by going with DLSS balanced. Now, DLSS balanced still looks fine at 1440p for me. I know it does sound contradictory because I'm not a big fan of DLSS performance at 4K, but I'm a little bit more. I do notice the issues with DLSS performance at 4K a little bit more than I do DLSS balanced at 1440p. I'm not sure, maybe I'm just not looking at it the correct way. But now we are getting 130-ish frames per second. This is actually perfectly fine. Our average PC latency is 40 milliseconds, which is, I mean, it is quite a bit higher than previously. We were seeing around 25 millisecond average PC latency at around 120 frames per second native without any frame generation or any ray tracing. So, I mean, there are definitely some concessions you have to consider, and but I do think this is perfectly fine at 1440p, 120, 130 frames per second with decent image quality in the form of DLSS balanced, and then frame generation as well. Let's just disable frame generation here quickly. I just want to see, oops, wrong settings. If we disable frame generation here, now you'd see that DLSS trade reconstruction actually did enable when we enabled path tracing. So without frame generation, our PC latency is 30-ish milliseconds, which is around 10 milliseconds lower than previously. It does fluctuate a bit, but we are getting 70-ish frames per second here, but it does feel pretty good, right? So DLSS balanced with path tracing enabled meets the requirement of 60 frames per second according to the poll, right? And I know it's not native resolution, which might irk some people, but unfortunately path tracing is just so heavy. Alright, so 70-ish frames per second here, DLSS balanced, no frame generation. Game looks plenty good and runs plenty well, and I think that's going to be it for this one. I just have one more game to test, and then we'll call this video. Alright, actually I lied, I needed to test this at 4K as well. So here we are with full path tracing enabled DLSS performance, and we are getting close to 60 frames per second. So almost the same as with Black Myth Wukong, although actually I think Black Myth Wukong Yeah, I think we got more or less the same performance as DLSS performance, right? So let me just show you the settings here, make sure that everything is correct. So 4K and then DLSS performance with path tracing enabled here. So I think 60 frames per second maintained should be perfectly fine with DLSS Ultra performance. And I mean, once again, concessions have to be made if you want to run 60 plus frames per second. Now, our average PC latency is around 30-ish milliseconds, which is perfectly fine. And 80 frames per second is fine, but right, so some textures don't load in. This game's LOD is kind of broken at times because these textures load in, yet those did not. It does happen sometimes, but 82-ish frames per second here, perfectly fine. Although, as I said, DLSS Ultra performance is not ideal. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation here. And remember, we were getting around 30-ish milliseconds of latency. And let's just give it time. Does DLSS frame generation? So this is the thing that I don't think it applied. Maybe I have to restart the game now for it to actually work, which is kind of weird. Previously we did not have to. All right, so now it seems to work fine. You can just look at the frame time graph and the average PC latency. It's higher. We are sitting at 46 milliseconds average PC latency, 120-ish frames per second, and our LOD is still broken, so these things still did not load in. These ones, so no, also did not. Okay, not sure what's going on here. It's not a VRAM issue. We have 16 gigabyte and we only are using 9.8 gigabytes, so it's definitely not a VRAM issue, but it looks horrible. DLSS Ultra performance here, getting us 120 frames per second with frame generation enabled and PC latency of 43 at 4K. Not something that I would personally consider path tracing. If you are interested in path tracing, I think 1440p is the best bet for the RTX 4080 Super. Alright, now it's time for the last game. Alright, so for our last game, we are going to have a look at Alan Wake 2. And I'm just testing in this specific forest area because it is very demanding. It is actually one of the more demanding areas in the game, but I won't be testing all the different settings and do a full benchmark run. I'm just going to show you the performance hit here. So if we have a look at our settings, currently we are at 1440p with DLAA enabled, so native resolution. We are on the high preset, right, and no ray tracing. So ray tracing is disabled here. And we are getting 80-ish frames per second. Let me get rid of the lows there. We're just going to have a look at our frame rate. And PC latency average is sitting at around 36 milliseconds. So let's see what the hit is if we enable full path tracing. Yeah, it's been a while since I tested this game, so I'm not entirely sure which would be only path tracing options, right? So it might be just the direct lighting and the indirect lighting, but we'll just enable all of them on the high preset. Okay, so let's just see here, 38 frames per second. So native path tracing 1440p not going to happen here. Let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. Maybe DLSS quality will be able to get us there, although might doubt it as well. Ah, there we go, 60 frames per second. Oops, I said we're not going to have a look at the lows. I'm just going to move around here a bit. So if you do get 60 frames per second in this specific spot, you'll be able to get more than this, around 80 to 90 in town. That's what I've seen, but that's also as far as I've played the game. So 60 to 63 frames per second here, DLSS quality. So let's see frame generation here quickly. Let's just have a look at our average PC latency. I mean, that's average PC latency, so it needs to come down. We are seeing 45 milliseconds of average PC latency. All right, so let's go ahead and just then enable DLSS frame generation here. And if we have a look at our frame rate now, we are getting 107 and 107 frames per second, and our PC latency is sitting at around 58. Now that is quite a bit higher than what it was at around 40 before, when we started without frame generation. But this game is actually perfectly fine with 50-ish milliseconds, although it does have shooting elements. it doesn't feel horrible at all. So 59-ish frames per second, sorry, 59-ish millisecond average PC latency. So let's just see, getting 107 frames per second there. Let's try DLSS balanced. See, this one actually does show you the internal render resolution, so that's actually quite nice. Now 107 frames per second becomes 120-ish frames per second. Average PC latency is not much lower, 54, I'm dyslexic, 50 to 60 millisecond average PC latency. So we did not gain that much there, but 120-ish frames per second motion fluidity is perfectly fine for me. But once again, native resolution, path tracing, definitely not possible. I'm going to leave these exact same settings, right? We're getting 120 frames per second. Let's switch this over to 4K. Let's see, there we go. So 4K, and I'm not going to be changing any of the settings here. Actually 70-ish frames per second, more than I expected, but PC latency 90-ish milliseconds. That's definitely, you're going to feel that in the morning. So 60 frames per second with frame generation enabled, it's a horrible experience. So let's go ahead and disable frame generation here quickly, and let's just see, we'll probably have to go down to ultra performance again to hit 60 frames per second. I know that the overlay metric is a bit smaller than previously, but I did not change it. So let me just do that quickly. All right, so I just made the overlay a little bit bigger, but you can see we are still between 40 and 50-ish frames per second here. It's I don't think it's going to happen here at 4K for us, but let's see ultra performance. Once again, it helped us in the other games, so let's just I mean, once again, it's not something that I personally would recommend, but I mean, if you do want 60 frames per second with full path tracing enabled at 4K, then here you go. You got 60 frames per second. PC latency, do we have frame generation enabled? PC latency is sitting at 90-ish milliseconds. That's very, very high. Let's just see if we do have we don't have frame generation enabled. So why is the PC latency this high? I mean, it should not be nearly this high at 60 frames per second. Kind of strange, and it does feel kind of floaty. Maybe there is some issue with frame generation. Let's just see if Nvidia Reflex is enabled and see if that actually can make a difference here for us. I'm not entirely sure where to find that. Actually, it doesn't seem like we can toggle Nvidia Reflex separately, which is very, very strange. All right, so anyway, we're getting around 90-ish milliseconds and just above 60 frames per second. So let's enable frame generation. We are still getting around 100 and between 120 and 130. There we go. So 90 milliseconds, 84. I don't know, that maybe the reading of the average PC latency is not accurate. I think that might be it, because it does feel better. It doesn't feel like we are getting 100 and something milliseconds here, but we are getting 100 frames per second. And I just want to show you one thing here with the DLSS set to ultra performance. I hope I don't die. I probably will die because I can't remember the settings or the keybinds. But the flashlight, actually at 4K doesn't look too terrible, and it probably won't come across in the video, but the flashlight has a lot of graininess to it when it actually lights the shadows there in the distance. But at 4K, it's actually a lot more noticeable at 1440p. I think that's what you do. There we go. Okay, so see, even at 100 frames per second, we're able to kill enemies. All right, I think this video has gone on long enough for 3 games. I just wanted to be as thorough as possible to cover as many settings as possible. But 4K, unfortunately, in all 3 games, we had to drop down to ultra performance to get to around 60-ish frames per second base frame rate, and that's just not ideal for me personally. Although the game might look okay, you will probably see some issues in other areas. All right, I think that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, We hope to see you in the next one.